In the name of the one and only, in the foreverness of the joy of being lost and being found, travel the length of the same journey. Having arrived is no more than an expectation, where now defies its own self in the perpetuity of time. In anticipation, there loses its head, trying to escape the reality of the moment at hand. We are here today to enlighten each other. Although I'm formally in the position to be imparting with what quote-unquote wisdom I know, the reality is that my lectures are my best classrooms. That's where I learn more, albeit without the recognition that it's usually given to the audience. Today's talk is on Islam between conformity and modernity. The title wasn't chosen by me, but it was given to me, and I'm talking about a topic I don't agree with, because this implies that conformity should be done only with the past, with the tradition, not with the present. I believe one can conform with the past as much as one can conform with the present. So a correct title would have been Islam between modernity and traditionalism, where you have both as your option and you can conform to one or the other depending on your orientation and your sense of world view. I sometimes think that if we go through the concept of visualizing a pictorial representation, creating an image, it has the effect of one trying to reduce the complexity of thought into a form, a shape, a color, but at the same time it helps us understand what is it meant by. So if you think about conformity, modernity, that must be too much of an abstraction. I could talk about this topic on this one single slide for the whole hour, but I wouldn't do that, because I think we already have enough of an inherent boredom in the subject matter. So we'll avoid that. So I believe that the Muslim world in general, in its thought, in its philosophy, in its endeavors, suffers from a lot of maladies of the psychological form as well as the sociological form, but nonetheless they all fall within the realm of the historical. The slide you see on the screen, systemic obsolescence. This, in my view, is the heart. I shouldn't even say the heart, because heart is so beautiful, but this is the crux of the matter. This is where things have gone wrong, and they have been going wrong for too long, and I hope we don't continue on this path. But in my view, as you can see here in the slide, I don't know if the arrow shows through, on the left side is the Holy Qur'an, revelation from high up. It comes down to the world of creation, to humanity. If it is believed by Muslims, and if it's understood by even non-Muslims, that Qur'an has its own eternity, it's there forever, then, however, that forever will be within the realm of the human life, not God's, because that is eternal. So within that foreverness there, Qur'an should not get old. Its ideas should not become obsolete. So everything should be, because we believe there is no other revelation. So if this is the last revelation, then Qur'an is always new. And why are we getting so old? And I don't mean age-wise, but I mean age-wise. But where we have kind of been marginalized or have marginalized ourselves is that we take the Qur'an and whatever the interpretations that are shown here, like they're time-sensitive, time constraints, interpretive studies that are based on the Qur'an on the basis of fiqh, kalam, and the different interpretation of the madhahib. That interpretation of the Qur'an happened in the early period of Islam. So we detached it, we detached the interpretation from the Qur'an, and we tried to apply it to our life over here. Once enough of this was done, in philosophy, in spiritualism, in Sufism, in Tasawwuf, and in all the other means of learning, through knowledge and for wisdom, when that extrapolation took place, that was some 1400 years ago. And the latest of those would probably have been at least 1,000 years ago. What happened after the 1,000 years, now we are coming this way. We are down here where you see the now. This is our present. That other corner is the time of the revelation. From there we reach here by this other column that comes down here. That is the imitative replaces the creative. We have stopped creating. We have stopped interpreting. We are using the old interpretation that are the latest, the freshest of those would be 1,000 years old. So from that which was interpreted 1,000 years to 1,400 years ago, that knowledge is recycled over and over and over. That is what is considered authentic. And that's where the problem is. Because the Qur'an, as we talked about it earlier, in its own continuity, is down here, 1,400 years later. But from this 1,400 year later Qur'an, there are no interpretations. There is this detachment. That is the missing link. Is that instead of using Qur'an as the main source, instead of attaching, plugging into, tapping onto Qur'an for our time, in our terms, for our needs, for our problems, we are using interpretations that are obsolete in language for problems that no longer exist, for conflicts that are not part of our life. They don't affect us one way or another. Just to give you, I'm not trivializing the great scholars who went through this work. They were great scholars. They did great work. Islam as a religion and Qur'an as a book has been analyzed, interpreted, studied as a field of scholarship more than any other scripture. So what we know is roughly 400 years of scholarship in the Qur'an. But the problem is, it's all old scholarship. So if we go back to, say, 1100 or 1200 years ago, here was a problem. When for the first time women could, from faraway lands, could come for Hajj, one of the scholars interpreted that the woman should perform the Hajj or the pilgrimage separately, because from whatever tradition he had come, he had said, if a man's hand touches a woman's hand, he needs to make ablution again. Okay? Now, we could understand where he must have come from, his cultural mindset. that may not have been totally Islamic. But when culture and religion blend, sometimes we get all these confusing signals. So now they were saying that when you go to Hajj, and it's pretty crowded, and it's inevitable for two human beings' hands to touch. So what happens? You don't have wudu, or is your pilgrimage not valid anymore? And so finally they came up with the practical thing, like, well, okay, we can make an exception. And they had to go to Imam Hanifa, who gave his own interpretation and saying there's nothing wrong for a man and a woman's hand to touch, even if they are not mahram, even if they are not husband and wife. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So they say, okay, for Hajj, we can become Hanafis. But outside the Hajj, we can be Shafi'is or Malikis or Jafaris or whatever interpretation they accepted. Now, what part of that was Qur'an then, and what part of that is Qur'an now? And I would emphatically say none of it. It has nothing to do with your belief system, with your purity, or with your purification. But the interpretations have become part of our quote-unquote religious belief system, which is, correctly speaking, religion / culture / tradition / a whole lot of other phenomena that doesn't deserve to be there. But through these hyphenations, we have convoluted things that practically makes it impractical. Now, let me turn on to well, like I was saying, that we have to accept and credit the scholars and the scholarship for what it was. I'm not putting it down. All I'm saying is that it's not, most of it is not relevant for now. The example I give you is a trivial one, but there are many more. That when Muslim scholars get together, in order for them to sound authentic, they have to quote one of the old scholars. And even more so, they have to iterate it in Arabic. So now, you spoke it in Arabic, and you rooted it in the scholarship of a man who lived 1300 years ago. And voila, no more question, no more thinking. There's also a problem, now we are moving to another source here. This is in the context of the authenticity of what is being said. And again, I'm using only the Prophet's hadith as an example. So the red arrow here at the top, that's then, this is now here, same orientation. So this is when the Prophet lived. Okay, he lived as a human being, like you and I. He breathed, he was getting hungry, he was getting thirsty, he was a companion to his friends, a husband to his wife, father to his children, just like us, a human being. Okay, nothing more, nothing less. But what made him more is the message he brought. He became the link, the missing link between the divine and the human. Okay? Now, so what he said was said then. But the political environment was so charged, and of course the Prophet always prevented people from writing down what he was saying because he didn't want this to get confused with the Quranic language. In order for Qur'an to remain the single source, the main source, the only source, the most authentic source, nothing else had to be compared with it or put next to it. Well, as religion in its purity changed to tradition with its impurities, it then became a time. And of course, in terms of the reality of life, that man who lived in temporality was no longer with us at some point in time. So when he passed away, when he was living, Whatever problem people had, they would go to him. I'm talking about the Meccan or Medina community. So there was no question of authenticity. You had a problem, you go to the Prophet. Well, when there was no Prophet, what did we do now? That's when the problem began, because they said, well, if he's not here, we have to figure out what would have happened if he had been here. And so the reference to his sayings, to his actions, to his approved deeds became a necessity. While the atmosphere in Medina was calm and quiet and there was no political conflict, that was wonderful. People start collecting the ahadith or the sayings of the Prophet, they wrote them down, and they say, well, we can refer to these when the Qur'an cannot answer our questions. But when the political environment became charged, people used that same method, that same discourse, that same procedure, but instead of authenticating what was being said in the context of religion, they tried to give an air of authenticity to their own political whims. What they wanted to do politically, and people would not listen to them, perhaps it made sense, perhaps it didn't make sense, they said, well, but I think the Prophet had said such and such. Well, how do we know? Well, because he had said it to so-and-so. And this so-and-so and such became a tradition. Now, there is a, to say the word so-and-so on such and such in Arabic, you often refer to it in the language as an. Abdullah an. Abdullah said it from. And from Zubair. And Zubair said it an. And this an became what we call an-anat in Arabic. The froms. So the froms, the an-anat or an-ana that we are also using in Persian, is that link which should not be there. But it's the link that has been created artificially. So whatever we do, we say, if we cannot explain it, we say, oh, it's our an-ana. And we think that's a religion. But it's a point of reference. And the context was pretty bad. Later we move on to a point where thousands of claimed sayings of the prophets were recorded by people, and they became so voluminous that the sayings of the prophets became more than the Qur'an itself. And that's when the fiqh scholars, now we are moving to the orange color here, the fiqh scholars got together, they said, we have to do something. We have to separate the wheat from the shaft. We have to find the authentic, separate the authentic from the inauthentic. And they developed a method which was like a 6-step scale, that for any hadith to be authentic must pass these 6 tests. I'll just give you a few examples. One, for instance, the chain of reporting should be uninterrupted. The person reporting must have credibility with the society for being an honest person, and so on and so forth. So once this criteria of authenticating happened from the thousands of the hadith, I think 140 or so were accepted. These are the only ones. So again, the difference between quality and quantity. Those few were accepted. However, the scholars wanted to show that this was not done arbitrarily, and that they had looked through all these other ahadith, or the sayings of the Prophet, and they recorded them all. They wrote them down, and simply to show that if anyone makes reference to any of these hadith, this would be among the inauthentic, and you go over here, you go over there. Now, in the course of time, the inauthentic and the authentic were published in the same books. Take Bukhari's 12 volume of a hadith, for instance. Okay? And when you look at the size of the work this man did, I mean, it's scary in some ways. Like, it's so huge. It's so extensive, and it's so detailed that perhaps only he could understand, and rightly so. If he could understand all of it, then it implies that most of us don't understand. And so now people still go to his book and they say, well, this hadith is an authentic one, so how? Just because it's in his book. I saw it, I read it myself. But that wasn't the intent. It was there to be a point of reference to tell people this is not authentic. And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't match the character, the personality of the Prophet. The person we know could not have said such a thing, could not have done such a thing. So those that were put there for reference are brought back into the realm of authentic and totally acceptable. And again, the chaff and the wheat that were separated, we put them back together. And then we come to the yellow arrow down here at the bottom. Then came a time for reform. And this next period of reform that happened on the Arabian Peninsula, a great reformer who did wonderful things for the Muslims at his time. We often forget that because we assume that Qur'an was revealed on the Arabian Peninsula, that perhaps every grain of sand on that peninsula is holy. Not so. We somehow think that anyone who lives there or who even speaks that language must have some degree of authenticity. But the point is that when Islam as a religion slowly evolved into Islam as a civilization and moved from the south, from Mecca to Medina, from Medina to Damascus, from Damascus to Kufa, from Kufa to Baghdad. As this movement northbound occurred, in the back, it left a shadow that eventually became total darkness. And the Arabs of the peninsula reverted to practices that were not just un-Islamic, but in many cases anti-Islamic. And Muhammad Abdul Wahhab came in the 17th century and he tried to reconvert the Arabs of the peninsula back into Islam. Now, the Arabian Peninsula is a secluded place. It's a peninsula. It's kind of like when you're driving and you see, not a through street, and so of course you don't even bother. So the civilizational aspect of Islam was on the main stage. Okay, from Baghdad onward, north, east, and west, all over. But the Arabian Peninsula remained in the dark. So when he wanted to, and I have to use this with a qualification, when he wanted to reconvert those Muslims, the best thing he could find, the best method he could find was that if he tried to speak to them the Quranic Arabic, for most of them it was just beautiful poetry, but it didn't make sense because they were so detached from it. But the things they could relate to more were the sayings of another Arab before them, the Prophet himself. And so this man found a very effective method in which he said, this is what the Prophet said. And the concept of asabiya that Arabs use, the patriarchal order, that if our own son, favored son, had said it, no questions, we accept everything. So because of this level of, a high level of acceptability, Abdul Wahhab said, okay, he started at the concept of the Ahlul Hadith. So those who followed the way of the Prophet, which was a wonderful thing. But here was the problem, that what Muhammad Abdul Wahhab said in the beginning, that will be the beginning of Wahhabism. He was a great scholar. He knew what he was saying. He knew which ahadith to quote, which sayings to make reference to. But in the course of time, those other 6,000-7,000 ahadith, they found their way. And then on the basis of that, everything became re-authenticated. And with it, the absolute rigidity, the absolute non-compromise, and the absolute single-mindedness of the second reconversion of Arabia became the dominant form. And so, yes, they look every bit Muslim, and of course they are Muslim, and they pray, and they do zakat, and they do everything that everybody else does. But they do it with the rigidity of the mind, which the Prophet had rejected long before. And so that was re-institutionalized, the re-institutionalization of a certain form of, I would call, Jahiliyyah, revisiting. Now, so again, we are still in the 17th century. I hope you can bear with me by the time we get to today, if we will. Let's move on to a general analysis. Then, what does this mean? Yeah, historical, yes, but there are other dimensions to it. And here is a historical perspective. That because of the rigidity that was institutionalized, now we can't blame everything on Muhammad Abdul Wahab. In the rest of the Muslim world, the same thing was happening. In most of the Sunni scholarship, rigidity became part of the government because the Khalifa in Baghdad had accepted it. So on the Sunni side, the first four schools, and I don't mean by first in terms of prioritizing, just numerical four. In there, the authentic things was that you could not operate outside of these four schools of Hanbali, Maliki, Shafi'i, and all that. So because the Khalifa said no more ijtihad, no more interpretation, leave it at that. And again, this we will get into a long history, and I don't think we can afford it, but just to give you a little glimpse of it as to why this happened. Because the Muslim world became more democratic than anything we have seen, even today in the 21st century. Because there was not only religious pluralism, there was ethnic diversity, there was also legal pluralism. Within the same city, different schools of thought and different schools of legal interpretations were prevalent and acting at one and the same time. So if you had a case in West Los Angeles and you went to the court and you found that the judge interprets it in the school of Shafi'i, and if that didn't help your case, you went to East LA and you found a judge who would interpret it in the context of the Jafari school, and that might help you. And if you didn't like that one, then you went to another one in Long Beach who would be interpreting in the Maliki school. Within the same system of government, there was a plurality of legal systems. Now, it got to a point where this created a headache for the government, and they said, like, wait a minute, we have to have some kind of a standard. And so the Khalifa invited Imam Hanifa and said, look, you're a great scholar, everybody loves you, and I want you to become now I'm using the allegories and symbolism in terms of cultural differences that we live in. The equivalent of the judge of the Supreme Court for the whole Muslim state. And who would miss that opportunity? But what saved the Muslim world from theocracy was this man's stand. Imam Hanifa told Khalifa, and I wasn't there to quote him exactly, but something to the effect that, what makes me Hanifa, what gives me all the followers, what gives me authority, is because my thoughts are out there challenging the thoughts of other scholars. So when people find merit in my ideas, they follow it. If you want to make me the only one and take all the competition away from me, I will not only become your mouthpiece, I'm sure he didn't use this word, and he said, you're taking your competition away from me, and even I would not be challenged intellectually. Sorry, but no thanks, I wouldn't accept that. And when the Khalifa saw his audacity for challenging him, but rejecting the highest position in the government, and also because he said, your Sharia, your fiqh will be the only one accepted in every court. And he said, no, I don't want the monopoly. Well, long story short, they put him in jail. But he wouldn't give up. And in my humble opinion, this was the first challenge where Islam was facing the formation of theocracy, and the scholars saved us. And the scholars didn't submit to their egos and power-centeredness. Look, I'll be such an important person, why not? But they say, no, the ideas are more important than the individual. I will not accept it. His path was followed by several others. So sometimes in the Western scholarship, they lump together the Muslim ulama, and they did this and that and the other. They did great things. And I think nobody perhaps in history, or at least in our modern times, have made such a great sacrifice for themselves to keep religion and state separate. So when people are talking about separation of state and church, mostly they don't know what they're talking about, unless they're talking about Europe. Because in the Muslim world, that was already guaranteed, that there will be no blending. So let's go to the historical. So that is what was happening there. But what we are suffering from now, we are now analyzing ourselves as individuals, is that most Muslims live in the past glory. They see the glory and not the past. And anytime you talk about Islam, there's an automatic rewind button. I think we are in the CD age now. That it goes back to 1,000 years ago, see how great we were. And if somebody says, oh, hold it, I want to push the play button now, where we are, in the misery we are. And most of us don't want to play on that. That's what we have to do. The second one is that they are absent in the present, and they're not from the present, in a way. There's a sense of detachment there. The result is that there is no dream nor a reality. Because the dream is induced into the past, and the dream should be a dream for the future, and we are not looking to the future if we keep looking in the past. Remember, imagine driving while you're looking in the rear-view mirror all the time. And that brings us to these, this is the Muslim East, Christian West. The problem we have had eventually is that we were woken up, the Muslim world in general. Remember the glory of the past. That red line is the extent of the expansion of various Muslim states into Europe. It's approximate. And as the title suggests, it's the shifting lines of Christian-Muslim religious affiliation and that's the important part, and or influence between the 12th century and the 21st century. So around the 12th century, the line was over there. And just think about it. There was no America. So of the known world, not only was most of Asia Islamic, East Africa, all the way down to the Cape, was Muslim. And when I mean Muslim, either political influence or religious affiliation, either one. And of course, North Africa. So if you think of the known world of the time, 90% was Muslim. So what was Christian? This little corner, Northwest Europe. And the Christians in the Northwest felt trapped. They were surrounded. Of course, there is no America, so they were really surrounded geographically too. Well, for all that happened during the course of time. Today's line, the 21st century, is the blue one. So the territory in between is what has exchanged hands. politically, militarily, in any way you want to look at it. And this is not small territory. Okay? And that's what creates the tension between these two cultures. No matter how nice they talk, okay, either side, okay? You know, like the United States is a secular government. When it comes to this, nobody's secular. Okay? Or European countries, any European government. They are secular only in terms of their domestic policies. As soon as they operate or think globally, or at least regionally, that secularism is out the window. And the Islamic and Christian adversarial competition, that is the prevalent modus operandi. So this makes, of course, thinking a little bit difficult, thinking independently. So it gets another dimension, and this dimension I call the territorial identification. If we think like this is the stage, we have the Christian West on that side, Muslim East on this side, and in terms of modernity and traditional conformity, they fall within that territory. And what's wrong with this is that most people by default think that if you're modern, you're Western, and if you're Muslim, you're traditional. And that's it. No two ways about it. And this territoriality is a problem because I think at the end, these four boxes become two boxes like this one. So modern Christian West, traditional Muslim East. This becomes our identity, not our idea, not our mindset alone, but our identity. We operate within that. Now, because the matter is so closely related, I'm going to make one of my conclusions right here, which is, I believe that we have to work on what I have termed as detached identity rather than territorial identity. That if you're in the West, you're in the West, you're in the East, you're in the East, that you can't change. The geographic setting cannot be changed and does not have to be changed. But other things that come with it by association, as a baggage, okay, as a forced linking, or linking through perception, or creating a mindset, those have to be made independent, made clear. And for that, we have to go to something like this. That yes, there is a Christian West, that's geographic, you don't have to change it. And yes, there is a Muslim East, this you can't change. But all other ideas can come and go here. They are not the monopoly of anyone. So we don't have to automatically assume, like the two boxes we had before, that all these ideas would be acceptable to all. Now, I must emphasize here that this mindset is as much the Christian West mindset as it is the Muslim East. Take, for instance, we did talk about modernity and traditional, how they are assigned. What about democracy? You keep hearing about Western democracy. Like if democracy is a tree that only grows in the West, that the climate of other lands don't allow it to grow. You think like, you know, democracy is a big piece of rock or a mountain or something, you can't move it, it's Western. Far from it. I've written extensively on that separately, but just because the West claims democracy as its own, what is the reaction of the East? They detest it for exactly the same reason. So while the Qur'an clearly gives you the command, God says, وَأَمُرُكُمْ بِالشُّورَى. Okay, I command you. It's not just a request or a mention or a suggestion, it's a command that you run your affairs through consultation. This is the heart of democracy. This is the order of God. But if you label it as democracy, then you would see huge demonstrations saying, we don't want democracy. Democracy is Western, democracy is corrupt, and so on. So we push it to that camp. Now, what about the legal system that many states are passing laws against Sharia? The exact same thing but from the flip side of the geographic divide. And here, the pride that the American legal system takes in is that we have a federal system. And what's important here is that the governments are many, the legislative bodies are many, and they can legislate anything for their own state, for their own city, for their own county, or for the whole government. They have that freedom, which is exactly what Qur'an says. And that's the closest thing might be common law. Yes, so we do it, it's common law, it's a common thing. That's what Sharia is. Okay? Sharia is not the Qur'an. Sharia is based on Qur'an, but it's practiced by society according to their own needs, in their own place, in their own time. Because if you don't apply time and place to Qur'an, Qur'an is dead, rigid, only of the past. But if Qur'an is for all times, then time and place should be relevant. So if you apply for our time and place, doesn't matter what label you put on it, that is as much Sharia as it is democracy. Well, again, in the United States, they show sensitivity to this too. So let me sum up this in the context of a historical role reversal. At its zenith, the Muslim East was seen as a threat by its neighbors and was terrorized by the Crusaders from Europe and by the Mongols from North Asia. Now, at its zenith, the Christian/secular West is seen as a threat to its neighbors and is terrorized by religious extremists from the Middle East, and its economic dominance is challenged by East Asia. Exactly the same thing. Our terrorists were the Crusades, their terrorists are the Muslims. The Crusades raised their hand because they felt Christianity was threatened, and you have to protect it and revive it and do something about it because those Muslims were coming. And now, role reversal. Today, the Muslims are saying exactly the same thing about those Christians who are coming from the West. And as the woman in Baghdad used to put their children to sleep, they said, if you don't keep quiet, if you don't go to sleep, honey, democracy will be knocking at the door. And there were others who were saying even worse than that by saying that when they prayed, they would say, oh Jesus, save us from your followers. So, but that's exactly what was happening in Europe before the Crusades. Because the situation was politicized, and because of the dominance of the Muslim culture, like I showed you earlier in the map, and they felt threatened, like anytime they are going to come. Not that what they are going to say, that was a different thing. Not that what they are going to share, that's different. That requires another lecture by itself. But how it was perceived, and how it was manipulated, and how it was politicized. Well, let me give you a regional sense of these tensions. The Christian West saw the rise of Islam as a threat to its religious identity and its encirclement, like I showed you in the map, as a cause of its economic stagnation. So they say that if these Muslims wouldn't be here, we could go to all places. And often they mention India, because at that time India was the farthest. And as soon as that encirclement was broken, where did the Christians go?
India.
Everybody wanted to go to India. And this was India too, America. Remember when Columbus first came? He discovered India. So everything was India. Now, from the Muslim East sees the rise of the West as a threat to its religious identity and the exploitation of its economic resources as the cause of its economic stagnation. So now, the Muslims today are saying exactly the same thing. They say not only have they been encircled by the Christians from the West, but furthermore, as the next note explains, is that Muslims didn't exploit Christian economic resources. This was before the age of colonialism. The wars before colonialism were for ideology, religion, whatever it was, but it wasn't for taking natural resources from anyone. Whereas we now live in the post-colonial period where taking the resources is part of the whole deal. You invade a country, the first thing you do is that whatever Saddam Hussein has nationalized, denationalize. The second thing, invite all the corporations, open it for bidding, and anyone who didn't help in the war, like France, they were out. So it's way too obvious. But regardless, this is how some of these tensions in the historical context operate within them. Now, to sort of encapsulate the role reversal, look at it this way. There is Christian West, Islamic East here. And I'm separating this at the dates at the top are from 612 to about 1400. These are all approximate. And that will be the first period. The second period is for about 1500 to the present. So at that time, we had the Crusader suicidal mindset, where the Pope, the Innocent, and that's a very nice name for a Pope, he decreed that to kill 100 Muslims, you would go to paradise. That's how Crusades began, because killing Muslims was a way to paradise. Now, the second thing was that they saw science against religion. It was a Muslim thing. Christians, good Christians didn't do that. They just went to church. Science, no. Galileo, Copernicus, we have a whole lot of other stories that testify to that. And so sometimes when they brought Islamic scholarship to the West, they had to rewrite it and translate it and attribute it to a great patron bishop. So they had to write the work of an Islamic scholar under the name of a Christian monk or a Christian bishop or someone important, because that way people could read it. But if they saw that it had the name of especially those Muslims over there, they would stay away from it. And in other cases, in order to make it a little mild, they Latinized the name of every Muslim scholar whose work reached Europe. So Ibn Sina became Avicenna, Ibn Rushd became Averroes, and Razi became Rhazes, and so on and so forth. So they had to change it to make it a little bit mild and acceptable, because look, we have it too. It's not just that those Muslims have it. The third one is that somehow it becomes part of the package, the suppression of women in the name of religion. Yes, sure, burning at the stake. Yes, the witch hunts that followed us all the way to America here, in Boston, in Salem. Okay? So this was what Christianity was, 612 to 1400. Does any of it sound familiar? Jump to this corner. Okay? You had to kill 100 Muslims to go to paradise. Here, for the sake of 72 virgins in paradise, you had to bomb some place of the Christians. Same idea, same suicidal tendency. And I put jihadi in quotation because that's not what it means, but that's how it's used. And the same thing goes for the Crusades. Crusades come from cross. They're supposed to be the followers of Jesus, but that's not how they interpret it. Now, what do they see science as? Science and technology, it's a corrupting, whistling thing. We don't want that. Okay? And suppression of women in the name of religion? Any different? Perhaps burning at the stake, but in a different way. Just think about the time elapsed that we have in totality, our human civilization perhaps evolved and we have become relatively civilized, so we are probably not burning them at a stake, but they're not that far. So denying them education, okay? Look at the girl Malala Yousafzai in the London hospital. What's the difference? I wrote on my website that in the 1st century, we killed them in the 1st year of their life. In the 14th century, we killed them in the 14th year of their life. progress in Jahiliyyah. So, Hajj without mahram. There were women who were arrested the week before in Saudi Arabia. These women have come to, of all places, the house of God, without a doubt, for pilgrimage. And the Saudi government prevents them from performing Hajj because, look, they don't have a mahram. A mahram would be a legal guardian, and it has to be a man. Man, woman, same business over there. So everyone who became a witch in the West had to be a woman. So witch became synonymous with woman, whereas in an older form of the language that had to be an equal opportunity suppressor for men and women. But look at the counter side of it. That's where the Crusades were. This is where Islam was, which was ethnically inclusive, religious, cultural diversity I talked about earlier. They built roads and caravanserais and cultural bridges as well. Advances in science, technology, interconnectedness. This was the Muslim world. Think of the Tonk Road in India, all across, the tier of northern India. The Afghans built a road from Bengal all the way to Punjab. That is still operational today. Okay, look at Ibn Battuta, whose travelogue is probably now broken by Hillary Clinton. But there were no planes, there were no trains. And this man traveled 75,000 miles in his time, mostly on foot. Okay, read a National Geographic special on him. And it is not fantasy, there have been conferences on how did this man do it? And that's because they created a peaceful environment, which we correctly identified as Dar al-Islam, the abode of peace, where there would be no war. If there was any war, it was outside this Muslim domain, which they call Dar al-Harb. But of course, those terms are abused politically a whole lot, so I wouldn't go into it further. Now, look at the comparison of this, where the Muslims were, compare that over in the West. Ethnically diverse, culturally inclusive, building highways, byways, and information superhighways, the same connectedness, and advances in science and technology and everything. So yes, there is a time difference, but this was as advanced for its own time as that seems advanced to us. So they're one and the same, but a complete role reversal. Now, there is, I think I'm going to skip this one. From political perspective, this now happens in general, regardless of the topic, is that a dominant culture expands and grows, and in time it intrudes, it becomes necessary. And I'm not legitimizing it as necessary. Now, the dominated culture recoils in regression and in xenophobia. They're afraid of everything. So remember the 4 boxes? You can put them on both sides. Now, the result is that regional marginalization and global irrelevance. Where are the Muslims in the United Nations? They show up once a year for the General Assembly. Are they part of any peace process in any part? They're not even part of the peace in their own backyard, let alone in the world. They're totally irrelevant to the world politics, to science, to technology, to anything. Now, each shows sensitivity to the expression of the other, and I think I talked about that a little earlier. Here is a sociological perspective. Now, we have bundled entities, entangled identities. I said how we package it. Islam, regressive, traditional, backward. We all think that way. And the West, progressive, technologically advanced, and all that. So Western Europe culture will be that Christian religious modernity, Islamic will be, and I put the hadith here because of what I explained earlier. It's not a direct connection, but as one of the causes. So the result is that traditional Muslims versus modern Christians become the dichotomy. And which side would you vote for if you were none of those? And if you were, that would be a different story. Here is the psychological perspective. We have a selective modernity, we have technophiles with a retarded perspective. I give you an example. You talk to a young man in Los Angeles Valley, Orange County, somewhere there, and you would see him, in blue jeans, nice haircut, and everything. Like, you just look at him, he would look like almost anyone else, safe asking for his name. And then you say, like, so what do you do for a living? You say, oh, I just go to the local mosque all the time. We have a very nice imam, and the whole thing. So, like, what does that have to do with your life? That's your personal preference. And I've put hadith on the iPhone. So the minute you go something, no, you haven't heard it, here. They will go to their iPhone in hand, ready, chapter and verse, and they say, here is what the Prophet said. So you have a most modern technology, the iPhone, sorry, that's iPhone 5, right? Commercials allowed. But then what is in the iPhone is the obsolete thing that may not even be authentic. So simply thinking that if you can read a hadith of the Prophet, even if it's inauthentic, so long as you can read it on the iPhone, you're modern. That's the selective modernity. Now, wholesale acculturation, that will be the second group. That will be pop music, blue jeans, Christian names, and the whole 9 yards. There's the other group who would stay away from anything Muslim, Islamic, whatever, because they want to jump into Western idea, Western culture, because when they look at the alternative I showed you earlier, if they are unaffiliated, most of them are going to go the second round. The result is that the Muslim youth is lost in the past, they are irrelevant to the present. Now, what about Muslim adults? Obsessively religious and radically political. First, they don't talk, and if they talk, it's always the latest crisis that they are more up to date than the CNN and Fox and Wolf and all others combined. So everything is there. What happened in Iran, what happened in Syria, what happened in Afghanistan, everything, like I said, they would qualify as a good reporter. But then there's also the obsession of religion, is that for the average American, there is a generation gap between the young and the old, which is 1 generation. For the Muslims, it's probably 5 or 6 generation difference, because the son or the daughter was born here and is on the sort of quote-unquote cutting edge of everything modern. The father and the mother have not only come from an old country, they have come with an old mindset, and they operate in even an older interpretation of obsoletism I talked about earlier. So talk about detachment and generation gap, super generation gap there. So now we are going globally. So in the Muslims in the East, they are doubly suppressed. Once by their own government, second by the intrusion from the West. Forget about analyzing it politically, economically. It's there. So ask the Iraqi, who is worse? And every name they give is a layer of suppression. Saddam Hussein killed 200,000, George Bush killed 2 million, or 1 million, or whatever. This is not a mathematical number, but I'm saying it's the same killing, it's the same death and destruction and demise that terrifies the society. So they see Islam more as a cultural identity than a religious identity. I hope I'm not offending anyone. Right in the middle of nowhere, it's the Eid prayer. And you look at the mosque, it turns into a costume parade. The Nigerian is dressed like a Nigerian, the Pakistani like a Pakistani, the Indonesian. Somehow they believe that if they dress like where they had come from, then that makes them good Muslim. I don't mean to offend, but at least at the subconscious level, something might be working there that they associate with. We have a good example here with Brother Charles, who happens not to be here at the moment. Sometimes, I talked to him in one conference. He said, like, he's sitting with me, and we are talking about Qur'an, Islam, faith, whatever. And there's a little kid sitting in front of us in the row ahead of us. And he keeps looking and like, what is this man doing here? Like he is totally out of place because we attach our even ethnic identity. We define our religiosity by our ethnic identity instead of keeping them separate. So, in other words, the adults here become transplanted Pakistanis living in America. They're not terrorists, but they sure look like some in the minds of the average American. So when they call someone like a Middle Eastern looking man, what is Middle Eastern looking man? Is a transplanted, culturally transplanted person who lives here. And it has nothing to do with the religion. But the cultural identity takes over the religious identity, and you have to look like it instead of acting like it. The last one is that between nostalgia and dream, they gaze at the present that doesn't mirror the reality. So you can say you live in two worlds. In my view, most of us, at some level, live in the cracks between the two worlds. And these cracks, the separation, is getting wider and wider. And I shouldn't tell you what the consequences might be, but we could fall into it. Now, Muslims in the West, this is a different one. They live in a self-imposed alienation. Okay, we have been given the best opportunity that the Qur'an describes: diversity, multiplicity, intermingling. That the Prophet told us there is no difference between an Arab and a non-Arab. And yet, we come in this mingling place, in this intermingling environment, and yet we isolate ourselves. Remember how much we blamed the government for the encampment of the Japanese in World War II? Well, we create our own encampments voluntarily. You go to the different mosques, you know, a mosque is supposed to be a cultural identity neutral place. But many of our mosques are either a Pakistani mosque or an Arab mosque or this or that. Not most of them, thank God. So I can stay here until the end of the talk. So we are doing okay, we are fine. Now, the transcultural icons living in two worlds, but detached from both. So the last one is consider any deviation from the cultural norms as a deviation from religious norms. So, if you pray with your head not covered, I'm talking about men here, women haven't reached that level yet. So for men to cover, to pray with their heads not covered, in the mind of the average Afghan, Indian, Indonesian, that's a terrible thing, because the Prophet didn't do it. Okay? So they would say, like, for a good Muslim, you have to put something on. Yeah, for men, I'm talking about men. So if you go to some, Friday prayers, to many of the South Asian, Southeast Asian mosques, most people have the, I would call it the Muslim yarmulke, yeah. Yes. Now, if this sounds too unfamiliar, let's get it to the women level, right? So, what happens to the women? In many places, they would put a big sign, head scarf is required. Nobody is putting a sign saying honesty is required, faithfulness is required, purity is required. That's what makes us Muslim, at least what the Prophet said. We are, by nature, to live up to the highest qualities that the Prophet presented for us. And I hope I didn't offend anyone. I keep telling my wife that she looks most gorgeous in the scarf. And she does, believe me. But it's her preference not to. And so, of course, she's not playing to my heart sometimes, but that's a different story. The idea is that the cultural element supersedes in many cases. And so they will define you culturally and imply that it's religious. So what are the symptoms of conformity here? Muslims equate modernity with westernization and end up resenting one because of the other. and in an attempt to be un-Western, not non-Western, un-Western, they retreat to past glories of the East and become detached from the present reality. And in conclusion, we can say that Muslims must define modernity in its own right, not because it's owned by anyone, and it cannot be. And Muslims must own modernity as their right as much as the right of any human being, and it is not culturally defined, it's nobody's monopoly. So I better stop here, and thank you very much for your attention. I thought there would be no questions. Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zaman. Early on, I promised you he will present a very wide but incisive analysis spanning 14 centuries of Muslim religion and civilization and modernity. But before I go to the question and answer, I must tell you that my shirt is neither from the Muslim East nor from the Christian West. It is a present from Cambodia. Anyway, we'll take a few questions before we go for prayers. Anybody?
She was first.
Who raised the hand first?
Yes.
Ladies first, Mr. Shirazi. You first, please.
She was first. No, I wanted to ask you a question that it's been discussed in the past in our classroom and in other gatherings in Iman, and I'm still very puzzled. What I understood from your beginning of your speech was that we need to modernize the rules of our religion, according to the time. And what I've been told is that in the tradition of Islam, there was always a need for a marja, someone who would interpret the religion and the rules for the time. So you had to always follow the marja. I wanted to ask your opinion.
Well, as I said earlier, that the Sunnis suffer from officially, formally rigidified scholasticism, because the Khalifa said no more marja, no more interpretation. So the Shi'i said, like, good, so the Khalifa's rule doesn't apply to us, we are Jafaris, we can do what we want. And that was good, because at least officially the door was not closed. But I think if it hasn't been closed, they are slowly pushing the door towards the frame. So there's a kind of an inbuilt rigidity that kind of permeates it. So I would say that the Jafari school has a relative degree of advantage over the other four schools, because at least officially they can say that we can go to the marja. So I think the other point you mentioned is that I'm not suggesting that we modernize the principles of religion, or for that matter for any philosophy.
No,
the principles.
Interpretation of the principles.
We interpret. We go through interpretation all the time, and the reason of the interpretation. The perpetuity of interpretation is in the word itself. When we say interpret, you get an idea from outside, you put it into you, inside of yourself, you contemplate it, and you try to understand something from within. So we, of course, by nature we interpret things. But as far as the legal system or political situation is concerned, the principles stay the same. The application has to be considered in the context of time and place. So yes, we for instance, we fast. Nobody's questioning that. That's the principle. How we fast, how long we fast, and the funny example I always give, I don't know, it may not be funny, is that what happens if you're fasting in Alaska in the summer, from sunrise to sunset? That sunrise and sunset is 2.5 months apart. So you will be a wonderful, good, dead Muslim, gone to Alaska before you ever go to heaven.
Next is Haji Ahmad Shiraz.
Mina Khanum was second.
Okay, Mina Khanum first. Mina Khanum.
Well, Sultan, third person.
I'm very, very grateful for this presentation. I think it helps us to open our mind as Muslims to balance. But as you were saying about the clothing and so forth, I was thinking about the Jewish people who go around and they have their normal clothes and all their long coats and so forth, and their beards and so forth. And it seems like nobody criticizes them, but they criticize the Muslim ladies who are covering themselves. That's unfair. Also, the Americans are going around with bikinis and so on and so forth. There's no modesty there, and that's also unfair. So I think balance is something that should be kept in mind, plus the idea of modesty and respect.
I think it's a matter of time. The Jews were suffering from the same problem maybe 50 years ago, 60 years ago. There's prejudice is an equal opportunity employer in the sense that all they have to do is to change like those who are prejudiced, their gun is pointed in a certain direction. They simply move the targets past it. So one day it's the blacks, one day it's the Christians, one day it's the Muslims, one day it's the Christians. So if you have prejudice, if you create otherness, if you create animosity in others, all they have to do is to look for a target. But there's no difference. I think, religious communities, especially when they're a minority, the mathematical disparity implies that this will happen. And as far as your appreciation for the slides, I'm glad you say that, but I'm happier more than you are, because I was looking at these slides last night and my wife called on me, say like, what are you looking at? And I said, well, you won't believe, not that what I'm looking at, but what is looking at me. I was looking at these slides all alone, but I'm glad you're looking at it and you're getting some meaning out of it, so I will not be in trouble when I go home. This is what I was doing. Thank you.
And then next Hannah. No, first.
As you said, the West see the Islam as an obstacle for their going to India, and so therefore they try to take this obstacle out of their way. In England, they made a decision that since they cannot to take this out of their way, then they decide to destroy the religion from within. So they were looking for a person that knows about the religion, and so they found Abdul Wahab. And then they trained him, of course, and also he was well known, and also know about the religion, and therefore the same thing that they did with the Christianity to destroy the religion from within, they tried to do the same thing with Islam, and they brought all this Wahhabism that existing right now in the world, and it's the biggest problem that creates for the Muslim society, as their ideas are not by the Quranic, and it's not Quranic, and we are getting hurt by that. So, and this is not very, also it's not secret. They put out a book that explains all this, that they did this.
Mr. Shirazi, did you have a question?
I'm just saying that Wahhabism, that that has been trained by other people to destroy the religion from within, and we are getting hurt by this.
He wants to know if this is true or false.
My take on it is a little different. I think just like right now, what I'm advocating is change. So in the time of Muhammad Abdul Wahab, there was need for a change, especially in Arabia. That's why I give it the historical background. I think he did a great service by bringing the Arabs of the peninsula back into the fold of Islam. He did what he could, and he did it the best way that was working for him. But again, the thing is that it doesn't matter what Abdul Wahab was thinking, it matters how people apply it. it doesn't matter what Prophet Muhammad was thinking, it matters how people applied. So it's easy to be dismissive and always associate it like someone else did it to us. But the point is, right now, aren't we looking for someone who would, renovate, recreate, reinterpret, someone who would lead us? He led people, so he did a great service. We don't understand, we don't appreciate his work because we don't know how bad Arabia was. Like sometimes when people ask me questions on Afghanistan and the Taliban, they say, how did people go to the Taliban? And I say, the Taliban were wonderful. People went to them because of what was there prior to the Taliban. It was so much worse. And so the idea is that because we don't know how bad Arabia was before, we think he did something bad. I think he did. I don't know if there was any British connection, but that's a convenient thing, another thing for our Muslims, just like in this East-West dialogue. If we can't explain something, we always say the British did it to us, the Americans did it to us. I'm sure they had something to do with it, but we did it to ourselves. That's the most important.
But they are against, like, the woman going to school. First of all, they separate the woman.
No, I don't disagree with your examples, and I understand your objections, and I think I would be on your side in terms of your critique.
That he did. That's actually a damage he did to Islam.
But what I'm saying is that compared to what? Because we don't know how dark it was before that. That's what I'm saying. So,
the ideology was not his, but the West's. That's the point.
I don't have any proof on that, but it's possible.
Yeah, there is a book out, and I'm going to introduce the book.
It's possible, yeah.
Yes. من خیلی دوست داشتم راجع به آقای حنفی
ابو حنیفه
که صحبت کردیم و زیر بار در حقیقت خلیفه زمان نرفت که عامل اون باشه و حکومت کنه، در حقیقت حکومت معنوی کنه بر مردم. من شنیدم که ایشون شاگرد امام جعفر صادق بودن. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So پس این میتونیم این افتخار رو ریلیت کنیم به امام جعفر صادق و تعلیماتی که ایشون داده باشه. So thank you very much. چون من نمیدونستم حقیقتا ایشون شاگرد امام جعفر صادق بود.
The point is, we didn't have political Sunnis or political Shias at the time. This compartmentalization happened afterwards, and so when they were living, Imam Ja'far was not Shia and Imam Hanifa was not Sunni. We made them such in the course of history. We assigned identities, we stamped them one way or another after their life, and that is another way of looking at all this misery we live under, is that we have not only created the Muslim-Christian polarization, we have created polarization within the Muslim world, and one of those being the Shias and the Sunnis. And then you go to Pakistan, there are sub levels of everywhere. We humans, when we are in the dark, we don't see ourselves. And so whatever we can imagine is automatically the enemy.
Okay.
That's the darkness
second question. در مقام انتخاب ما بهتر نیست که یه معلم، یه تیچر، یه معلم رو به عنوان لیدر انتخاب کنیم تا شاگرد اون معلم. به نظر شما اون معلم صلاحیتش بیشتر از اون شاگرد نیست؟
For those of you who don't understand Portuguese, the question has to do with the ranks and degrees of Imam Ja'far, the founder of the Ja'fari school of Islamic jurisprudence, and one of his pupils, Imam Abu Hanifa. I think it's the schools of thoughts didn't come in terms of establishing a hierarchy. Who is above, who's below, who's good, who's bad. That wasn't the idea. It was these Muslim scholars who tried to understand Qur'an and Islam in general the best they could they had to give it their own interpretation. Islam in itself has all the flexibilities. Take Prophet Muhammad when he was in Mecca and someone came to him and said, I worked for so-and-so and I haven't been paid my salary. When am I entitled to? The Prophet said, you're entitled to what you have earned before the sweat on your forehead dries up. And so this became a motto, and everybody wanted to pay everybody on time. When they came to Medina, several people came, they said, look, you told us in Mecca, but these Medinans, they're like crazy. They tell me I will pay you 9 months later.
I owe you.
Yeah. And they said, how? So when the people are brought before, they said, look, in Medina, it's a farming community. We have gardens, we have orchards of olives and other trees, palm trees. And we hire labor in the summer. When they plant, we share with them whatever was produced in the harvest season, which comes in the fall. So forget about drying your sweat. So they looked at the Prophet and said, what do we do now? He says, this is right. So the Prophet accepted that one as well as this one. The important thing is the principle. You work, you're entitled to. When they can pay you is a matter of convenience. So I think it was these kind of matters that Islam and the Prophet's example provided all the flexibility. And it's this flexibility which should be used as the strength of Islam. Instead, it's monopolized and identified and owned, and I said, well, I like Imam Ja'far, and because he said this, then I accept it, even if in my own mind, I may like Imam Shafi's interpretation. Okay, I may like Imam Malik's interpretation. But we have territorialized these schools too. You know, like in most of our constitution, they're officially this or that. That's nowhere in Islam. So that is my...
You mentioned in the simplicity of hadith, the honesty of the chain of command and all that should not be broken. But you did not mention that the only thing, perhaps the best test of authenticity of the hadith is the source, which is the Qur'an. So if it's contradictory to the command of the Qur'an, then it becomes obsolete. It doesn't matter who said it or how it was said. And so that would reduce our dependence on other sources other than the Quran, and it's very relevant to our Quranic class because people can read the Quran and then when we discuss in the Quran, say that we get sources from the Quran itself that would explain something. And so a lot of times we go to the footnote and see what the footnote would have said to explain it. And I'm saying is that should not be given the criteria. And one way we can correct that is to read the Quran over and over and over and find references from the Quran itself to prove itself for us, to our understanding. And you didn't mention, which is the simplicity of the hadith, only if it's not contradictory.
Where would I be without you? Yeah, thank you for mentioning. I alluded to, but your question implies that probably it wasn't clear. And if I say they had, yeah, I didn't mention this one. There were 6 criteria. At least Imam Bukhari uses those, and the one you mentioned, which of course is the most important, that should be one of them. Yes, it cannot contradict Quran. It should not contradict the lifestyle of the Prophet. There are a few others. I didn't have the whole list, but that's a great point. Yeah, definitely. I know. Can I still go home with you then? I said,
And also, when you're referring to hadith, and we're referring to the companions of the Prophet, but who better was the most companion of the Prophet other than his wife and his daughter? And nobody is quoting them, saying,
no, they are.
Well, they are, but in the Muslim world or in the East or in the West, it's not common that somebody would refer to a woman's interpretation of the Quran or of the Prophet himself, what they actually did. Nobody, I mean, the only people that I know that they call themselves Fatimites, I don't even know what their philosophy is, but at least it tells me that they follow the chain of command of a woman and not. So that is not emphasized anywhere here.
Well, at the risk of you not taking me home with you, I guess I'll disagree with you there.
And your interpretation is saying that,
no.
I'm saying is, women women do hold half of the sky, and then that needs to be mentioned.
Oh, I disagree with you on that too. I think women hold more than half the sky. They always do. But the thing is that no, women are reporting as in hadith, especially Aisha. There are plenty. That is part of the jurisprudence. The thing is that a lot of things didn't happen in hadith. They are given. No, they are given. They are referred to. They are sourced. They are referenced.
Then how come I don't see any in your presentation?
I didn't put any there. I mentioned it in general, but it's a good point.
Good point.
Miss Khadija.
Oh,
You also have? Okay.
yeah. No,
And you read it out.
no.
Miss
First of all, thank you so much. My question is, with handshake, how should I best explain to my female colleague, my male colleague whom I would probably stand my hand across and just head shake without saying anything or giving him a handshake when he stretches his hand? How should I best intelligently explain to him?
You don't have to. The etiquette here in the Western culture suggests that the option of a handshake is the woman's prerogative. Men can only receive a woman's hand if the woman extends the hand. Man cannot. If a man knows, his manners correctly, man should never extend hand for handshake first. The woman does it. Man must take the glove off. Woman doesn't have to. Man must stand. A woman doesn't have to. And man must kneel down before kissing the hand, and a woman doesn't. So most of these are universal manners of...
That happens.
Hold on. So let me finish that one. So I think sometimes these etiquette and norms of mannerisms are messed up in a cross-cultural setting between Muslims, non-Muslim, Eastern and Westerners. But if we do it in most cultures, I think women have a much higher degree of having prerogatives. Now, the example I give you, I think that's way too obsolete, and I think I better end it. It's just obsolete. So if you don't want to shake hands, nobody should even think of making you taking the first step, so to say.
You should put at the end of your presentation, easier said than done.
Miss Mona. No.
Me?
Yes.
No, I mean...
Oh, you didn't have a question? I'm sorry.
Hi.
The gentleman.
I should not talk because I don't know this society, but because of one lady, I'm going to say this in 2 languages. Because I know what she is talking about. I read her mind, and this is frustrating me. To my understanding, those who believe in Islam, they should forget about, they should go to a person who is higher. If you are Muslim, you have to understand God's language. You should understand for yourself, not to go someone else to tell you what to do. Because his mind and his understanding is different from you. And if God has made us, we are all able to be educated. We are all able to understand the language of God. If you don't understand the language of God, what he's talking about, what he's telling you, I don't know. I don't know what to say. So please understand that if those interpret it to you, that okay, you need to have someone as a marja to go to him, he was exploiting us. He was exploiting you. The same as Catholic, that they said, do not read the Bible even. Don't read the Bible. We read the Bible. We understand the Bible.
Yeah.
Why? Because they wanted to explode the society, the mind, the humanity. Exactly what happened to Islam. If you want to understand God's language, you go and read for yourself. You go and understand for yourself. Not to go to someone to say, yes, you do this, you do that. His mind is different from your mind. His understanding is different from yours. And you are able to understand what God tells you.
I think there are two ways of looking at it. There are certain things that we all understand, but not all our understandings are the same. So at times it becomes necessary that, as we say in English, two heads are better than one, to consult, to exchange, to discuss, to understand. And yes, there are also times that, if you get inspired by someone, by the explanation and interpretation of someone, then it's okay to accept it. Now, is there a pitfall? Is there a chance for abuse in there? Yes, there is. Misuse of power and authority, religion, politics, and all of it does happen. But just because abuse happens, we cannot rule it out. So if a person can understand it better when someone else tells them, by all means, that's fine. But if a person has enough understanding that they would listen to the most repeated command in the Qur'an, which is repeated more than 100 times, God telling us, these are signs for those who think. So God is referring us to this marja here. But this marja sometimes can be pretty foggy. So if this marja answers, that's fine. If it doesn't, go to another marja. And of course, God has created all of us very intelligent, except that some of us are a little more intelligent than others. But we usually assume that the more intelligent ones are us. But I think both options should be okay. But they're equally important is that oftentimes when you interpret something yourself, you convince yourself that you understand it best. But you could be at fault. And without sharing it with someone, you could be going the wrong path for a long time before you make the U-turn. So there are positives in both and there are negatives in both. And so we have to pray, and I don't mean pray in terms of praying out of desperation, but we have to pray that when we say whatever we do, be God conscious and ask God that He puts His blessing, that the decision you're making is in according with God, that it's pleasing to God. Radiyatan mardiyah. So that you made a decision that God is pleased with, and it gets to a point where the decision you made is the only one that God's pleasure and your pleasure blend together. So let's hope for that. But yes, there are pitfalls on both sides.
The last question is for Mr. Nasrullah. He's come a long way. He deserves a question.
On the subject of what Prophet has said and what we are hearing that such and such said that Prophet said, you said they started studying and filtering these rawayats. Did ever anybody publish anything, anybody dare to do that? Is there a book?
Yeah, there are the Muhaddithun schools, most of them, Abu Muslim, Imam Bukhari, Abu Dawood. There are huge volumes of work done on this. They explain their methodologies, their procedures, their way of collection. Even Imam Malik, who doesn't really have too much of a methodology, but has a huge collection because he was in Mecca, in Medina with the Prophet. So people who were close acquaintance and in his company, they did that. There were people like Abu Huraira, who was, in terms of our modern lifestyle, an unemployed person, let's put it that way, who just hang out around the Prophet day and night. He didn't have anywhere to go and he didn't want to be anywhere. And he was an illiterate poor man. But he had learned so much, he had observed so much, absorbed so much from the Prophet that he's saying, so yes, there are many sources, written and unwritten. And the scholarship I was referring to, I used Abu Muslim only as one of the sources. Imam Bukhari as one of the sources. But there are many, many more. And like I said, those commentaries would take literally the lifetime of a person to comb through.